Let's get started. This is where you're supposed to be, or this is where you are. I don't know where you're supposed to be, but if it's not this, then you can stay or find where you actually wanted to be. But I think you'll find that this is actually where you want to be. So this is the introduction to Samvera. And we are going to get started with a round of introductions. But before we do that, we've been asked to use the microphone for questions and for our speaking so that our fans on the internet there can hear you when you say things. I think that throughout the workshop today, we're interested in you interrupting and asking questions and having a discussion. So please feel free to put your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you. So we'll introduce ourselves and then you are going to introduce yourselves so we can all know who's in the room. I'm Steve Van Tile. I'm the digital repository librarian at Oregon State University. I'm also the product owner for Hyrax, which is one of the solution bundles that the Samvera community puts together.
I'm Julie Allinson. I work for co-sector at the University of London. We're a small service provider. I think that's all I need to say.
So what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to cover these things. So what is Samvera? How do we work? Which is an interesting way to put that. We have some example sites to look at. So some implementations of Samvera repositories. A hands-on session, a technical detail session, and then we'll talk, Robin's going to talk a little bit about sort of what's the pitch, how do you market what we're doing to the people you need to market things to, and what next. And then we'll follow up with some Q&A, but as we mentioned, we're hoping you'll ask questions as we go along. Break around 3 for coffee. Any questions so far? Excellent. So Samvera, what is it, what does it do, and why is it different? So what is Samvera? Samvera is a robust repository kind of technology cluster, I guess is one way to put it. That is fronted by feature-rich tailored applications or solution bundles, as we refer to them oftentimes. So these solution bundles are collaboratively built. They can be adapted and modified to suit local needs. So some examples of solution bundles are Hyrax, Avalon, Haiku, and there are a handful maybe of others out there, but I'd say Hyrax, Avalon, Haiku are kind of 3 of the maybe highest profile solution bundles that are out there. What else are we? We're a community extending and enhancing these solutions. And I think maybe that last point is the most important part, that we're a community and we're working or we're trying to work together to help everybody get a little bit further along than we might get if we were working on our own. So why Samvera? Well, partly Samvera because we had to stop using the name Hydra. But maybe more importantly, so why Samvera? So we find that people who are involved in the community are looking for a flexible, rich and robust repository solution of some kind for some kind of repository. People also tend to be interested in this community because it's a community, because we work together, and because we build things together. We share resources, we share risks, and we share advances. We, I think as a community, assert that we is smarter than me. I say that to myself every time I look in the mirror. And especially in this crowd, right? We really do act as a community and we work together on things and find that the more collaboration we do, the better off we are. Possibly other reasons to become part of this community, because it's open software. To a certain extent, you're then controlling your own destiny. You have a hand in the products that are being built. and how they're being built and the decision-making process around things like prioritization and timing. We think that being involved in this community helps to build capacity at your own institution for supporting your repository needs. And in a lot of spaces, this is the way work is getting done now, right? Very relatively few open communities have people who are just like adopting software and then going off and doing it their own. Community work, especially in open source, is the way these projects go, and so we find that to be useful. I think, as I've already said like 1,000 times, but I'll continue saying it. So our first fundamental assumption in the slide deck is that no single system can provide the full range of repository-based solutions for a given institution's needs. But if we want to have sustainable solutions, they require a common repository infrastructure. And that's kind of what the Samvera infrastructure is, right? So, we have, I think, many of us needs for a lot of different types of content to live in a digital repository of some kind. And like we mentioned, it's possible to build a repository for each of these kinds of content. That may not be the best approach, especially if we're an institution with a lot of different types of digital repository needs out there. With this Siloville approach, if we have repositories for all of these different types of content, we run into all kinds of issues around management, enhancement, upgrading, and all of these types of things. And it feels the more of these silos we build at our institutions in the repository space, it starts to feel a little bit less tenable to maintain all of this. Sustainability is an issue. So what we think the Samvera community is providing, and we have some good examples of this, is the ability to kind of work from a common framework and a common set of technologies to build or to implement different repository applications for these varieties of content. This doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to have a digital repository for all of your stuff, but what many of us find is that if we have to stand up 2 digital repositories for 2 different types of content, if it's all on the same framework, and even more exciting, if it's all on the same platform or solution bundle, we find some efficiencies in our process by kind of collapsing our training and technology needs around one set of technologies. So, CRUD and repositories. I mean, the basic functionality that we find in any digital repository system is create, what's the R?
Read.
Create, read, update, and delete, destroy. It's destroy. And so the Samvera solution bundles that are out there and Samvera technology offers kind of at a very base level CRUD functionality, which one would expect. But we also work very hard to implement beyond CRUD. So implementing things like social features, preservation features, and so on to kind of round out the functionality of the solution bundles that we're putting together. And offer components of solution bundles that you can use to build your own repository if you don't care to use one of the solution bundles that's out there.
Preservation.
Or I can repeat the question if you want to go ahead.
How new are the preservation features to Samvera?
How new are the preservation features? So that's a good question, and I always feel a little bit sheepish about answering it. Some of them are not new, right? So any of the features that exist in Fedora, for example, that are preservation-y, which is not everything, have been there from the get-go, right? Fedora is kind of the back end at this point for all of the Samvera products, with an asterisk next to that for something we could talk about later. There are a handful of institutions that are experimenting with kind of implementing preservation functionality through other software and sort of folding that other software into the data work cycle for, or workflow for their repositories, and Richard probably has a lot to say about that if he wants to.
Whoever.
Or Julie. Well, Julie's right there, we'll just let her.
I think the thing we should say though up front is that Samvera on its own is not a preservation repository.
Samvera on its own is not a preservation repository.
It has got certain preservation features which will help you along the way, but if you're looking for a real preservation archive, you need to put something alongside it and make
Right.
that together. Something
Right.
like Archivematica or whatever.
Right, so just to repeat for our friends online, Samvera is not a preservation repository platform or technology stack. It has preservation features, but if you're looking for a full-blown preservation repository kind of system, there's a need to add other features with technology like Archivematica or other technologies. Give him the microphone.
Trying to implement Preservica, I think, as our preservation stack for this. But there's a whole bunch of things wrong with that. And it sounds like Valkyrie might have some of that.
Do you want to go ahead?
So, are there specific problems with Preservica?
Yeah, the blog interface isn't really that secure, right? They say that you can plug something into it, but it doesn't really seem like it's a secure way to pull the data out to publicly interface it.
Right, yeah. So with something like Preservica, Hyrax, to me, Hyrax would become your dissemination copy repository. So, and then Preservica would purely be doing preservation and pushing the preservation copies out to safe storage, and that your public aren't interfacing with preservation. So the way I think Hyrax would fit into that would be acting as that public interface. You can also index quite a lot of metadata into Hyrax, so you can use it as a way of kind of reviewing what you've got. Yeah, does that answer your question? Sort of. I don't know a huge amount about Preservica in the sense of what the APIs are like or anything like that, but I am working on something similar to that with Archivematica, which is an open source digital preservation system.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so the question about Valkyrie, folks, have you heard this word flying around this week or otherwise? Just to clarify, Valkyrie is essentially a tool that's been built and is going to be incorporated into Hyrax that allows one to sort of choose what backend you want to use. So you may be in a position where Fedora is not meeting your needs and you could go with some other kind of backend. But it's just this kind of like intermediary piece. I mean, it's a big deal, but it's an intermediary piece. It doesn't actually provide the backend. It provides a way for the rest of a Hyrax or whatever it is to communicate to various backends.
It has this concept of different, is it adapters?
Adapters, right?
So your data adapters and your metadata adapters. So if you could build a Preservica data adapter which directly wrote your data into Preservica, that could sit alongside another adapter that writes, say, your dissemination copies into some other file store, straight onto disk or Postgres or so. One of the strengths of Valkyrie is it's got this very clearly defined kind of API for building your adapters. So there are a handful that already exist. There's Solr, Postgres, Fedora. I think they're the three for data and file, just simple file store. So yeah, this is where Valkyrie starts to become more powerful because it allows you to plug different things in at the back.
So who's using Samvera things right now? We have lists that I will not go through because there are a lot of words here. Educational institutions of many sizes and of many flavors, cultural heritage institutions, and so on. And it's being used for a lot of different types of things, right? So we have repositories that are doing things like electronic theses and dissertations, digital preservation systems, research data management, and so on and so forth, right? So we have in our community lots of types of institutions doing lots of types of different things, which I think is exciting. And this kind of, I think this list of words actually highlights the flexibility that the things that we're building in this community offer. So it's nice to see the variety there. So how do we work, right? How do I get involved? I'm assuming you're here because you want to be involved. So fundamental assumption 2 is that no single institution can resource the development of a full range of solutions on its own. Asterisks. Each institution needs flexibility to tailor solutions to local demands and workflows. I mean, in theory, you could build lots of things on your own, but I think that there's a lot of resourcing needed for that. And so what I think we assert from this community is that we know that many, many institutions, if not most, can't build all of these things on their own, and that we can build them together. So what's the philosophy? Open architecture with many contributors to a common core of components or solution bundles. We collaboratively build these solution bundles that can be adapted and modified to suit local needs. A community of developers and adopters extending and enhancing the core. And this quote here, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I won't attribute that to anything because nobody actually knows where that comes from. But it's valuable anyway. Maybe. But there's value in it, right? I mean, it's kind of saying that if we work together, we can maybe do more things than if we were trying to do things on our own, for most of us. Samvera way. Samvera things generally are not directed projects. That's not to say that we don't have people who are trying to coordinate and shepherd things along, but we're not really a top-down organization. We, I think, rely really heavily on grassroots collaboration and pushing the things that we discover up to partners and steering, and we'll talk more about the structure of the community in a little bit. As a member of the community, you're investing in a framework, not in a product, right? So even these solution bundles that we talk about are essentially frameworks for implementing a repository. They're not a product that you can like take off the shelf and here you go. Some of them are getting close to that, but they're not like executable software applications, essentially. And what that means is that we need to contribute back to this code when we find problems or when we identify with others features that need to be built. There's a real contribution model here that we want to highlight. Investment in this community of people who have common needs rather than investing in a vendor. And travel and FaceTime is pretty important, right? So being at a conference like this, or being at Samvera Virtual Connect, or connecting with your Samvera folks when you're at DLF or Open Repositories or wherever you are, is super important. These, we're a distributed community, but being in the same room together is a very productive time, and we try to make the most of it. So participating is key. So the Samvera community was initially a joint development among Stanford University, you may have heard of that one, University of Virginia and University of Hull. So I don't think we have a Stanford in the room, but we have the other two, which is great. Samvera partners are kind of the backbone of the project. So it's a group of institutions that have decided to band together and really sort of drive the community forward. There are no fees or dues, and we have this kind of consensus style of governance that we've been working with for a while. There's also a steering group that provides high-level administration, continuity, and sort of a backstop as like questions come up that maybe need someone to like say, this is what we're going to do. Partners kind of play that role. But it's not that the partners are saying from the top down, here's what we're going to do. It's more of a like an additional level of administrative support that the steering provides. So there's no project director, there's no one architect, there's not a president of Samvera. It's all of us.
Steering, is it from partner institutions as well?
So who serves on steering? Is it from partner institutions? So the answer to that is yes. Partner institutions can serve on steering. There's an election process now that's relatively new through a governance change that happened over the last year or so. And here we are. Steering is elected by partners. Partners are formally committed institutions that have decided to become partners. There's a process on the wiki that describes how to go through becoming a partner. Working in interest groups, I think, are in many ways the kind of I guess bread and butter of the community in that these are the groups of people who gather together, interest groups, and talk about common topics of interest for Samvera community platforms and components. Working groups tend to be more kind of focused on getting a thing done. We need a new set of requirements built for some feature. We'll build a working group to do that. We have committers, we have developers who are working in the community to do development, software development on these components, and then we have community adopters, people who are using Samvera platforms or solution bundles. Did that answer your question about where steering comes from?
Yeah, and is it a rotating membership, I assume?
It is a rotating membership, and I don't recall the tenure. Is it 3-year tenure for steering group members, and then?
It's 3 years with protection of how people roll off. So if half of steering were to go, you'd still have people with varying numbers of years left and be able to elect other members. So very much what you would find consistent with other communities, or maybe even your own neighborhood like event. Yeah.
How big is steering?
Steering is,
Because of vacancy at the moment.
yeah.
So 9.
We want to keep it at 9, but you know, we can go as low as 5 and still get work done.
What happens at 4?
Well, you could have people facing off. You want to always maintain an odd number.
So partners, as an institution, apart from becoming an adopter and sort of an active member, partnership is kind of the next big thing that you could contribute or commit to. Partners are individuals, institutions, corporations, or other groups that have committed to contributing to the Samvera community. You can read the rest here. The idea, though, is that partners collaboratively advance the project and community for the benefit of everyone.
Was a partner, and when did they come off?
When did Fedora become a partner, and when did they come off?
People from the Fedora community have always been working collaboratively. And so generally you had somebody from DuraSpace, you know, involved in, so like David Wilcox is here for Samvera Connect. So we work very closely also with, I guess we don't really have, Blacklight and Solar are also part of it, but it's not like Fedora is or isn't a member. It's just somebody that we work very closely with, and it was the beginning repository that was part of the stack, and we still use it at UVA, so.
Right, and I believe DuraSpace is a partner, so
Yeah.
that's accurate. And so in some ways, the role the DuraSpace representative plays in those partner meetings is both as kind of an administrative coordination body, but also I find that the Fedora kind of line of reasoning comes through that.
But they're
that partnership.
non-voting. DuraSpace is non-voting.
Yeah, just to add what I hope might be a little bit of clarity and what might cause a bit of confusion. Yes, DuraSpace have been represented on the steering committee until recently. There's a vacancy now, and because it's now elected, we won't get another DuraSpace person because we actually know who the candidates are and there isn't anyone from DuraSpace. Excuse me, I said I had a cold. But we also, as it were, employ DuraSpace as a fiscal sponsor because they look after all our legal records, they provide financial services for us and things like that. So they actually operate in sort of two different worlds, if I can put it that way. They're a service provider to us, in a sense, but they were very heavily involved in the early days of Hydra because at that stage Fedora was the back-end storage. That's no longer the case in the sense that, yes, you can have Fedora, but we've got to the stage where now people can have other things if they want.
So how to train and get connected. We're going to go through a bunch of slides on this, but this is important. So a good way to train up on Samvera things and get connected is just read the documentation and do some stuff. Maybe not the best. Better than that is probably connecting through the social channels that we have, and we'll get to more of these, but like email lists, Slack channels, phone calls, and things like that, and through GitHub, so GitHub issues and so on and so forth. All of the code-based work that we do is done via GitHub, so that's kind of the one of the primary technical channels for conversation. One of the best ways to train and connect is to meet in person. So as I mentioned at this conference or at others, including the possibility of organizing regional Samvera get-togethers, which we've seen a few successful regional get-togethers in the last many years, so that's useful. So I think we've covered a lot of this, and I'm looking at the clock, maybe we can move here. So staying connected, there are a lot of ways to stay connected. We have a lot of communication channels in this community. Samvera.org is the website. We also have a wiki that is hosted through DuraSpace. So there's great information at both of those places. The wiki really, I think, is the core information gathering place for, uh-oh, Richard's coming to the microphone again.
Detail.
I'm going to slap wrists about this, I am. You will never remember that URL for the wiki. The quickest way to the wiki is samvera.org/wiki.
Right, which will redirect you to this ugly URL. Thank you, Richard. But yeah, most of the I think, apart from in GitHub, most of the information for the community is hosted in the wiki. So meeting agendas, working groups and interest groups, documentation about things like how to become a partner and so on are all hosted on that wiki. The partners have monthly calls which are open. Partner calls are open, so you can show up if you care to. There are a number of listservs through Google Groups that you can get on, including Samvera Community Group, which is really about sort of maybe some of the less technical details of what's going on in the community, and Samvera Tech Google Group, which is more technical, as you might suspect. And then these meetings that we talked about, partner meetings in Samvera Connect, Samvera Virtual Connect, and any kind of ad hoc get-togethers at other conferences that overlap in topic.
So I think I should clarify one thing. Yes, the partner mailing list and meetings are open to Samvera partners,
Oh.
but the community mailing list is open to anyone interested in just checking the community out.
And oftentimes there is an overlap in distribution of content to those spaces. So this is definitely.
But anyone at your institution, not just the representative, can take part in the partner calls. So we have our product owner often on those calls, which is really helpful.
As I mentioned before, interest groups and working groups are kind of a big deal in this community, and this is a mostly accurate and up-to-date example of a list of working groups and interest groups. And maybe looking through this, you can identify things that look important to you. Did I turn this off?
Yeah. All good.
Oh, test. For those listening online, I said some words that were not really that important. So interest groups and working groups, there's a lot going on here. Everything from metadata interest groups to interest groups related to people migrating from other platforms to Samvera platforms to working groups that are looking to build new features and are gathering requirements and things like that. So this is all on the wiki, so take a look and join up. As I mentioned, some of the primary communication channels are here. Slack is, in a lot of ways, the best way to have quick interaction with folks. The one caveat here at this point, although we're trying to rectify this, is that the Slack communication that we have doesn't get saved beyond about a little bit less than a month at this point, because it requires payment to get your archives. So if you're looking for a longer form discussion that's going to be around for a while, sending things to Google Groups and having more of a discussion there is good for longer term. Email can also be useful, but we worry about people getting left out of those emails. And then there are community calls that we have. So we have a Samvera Tech Call every Wednesday, which is more technically oriented. Any of those interest groups and working groups should be listing their communication times and channels on their wiki page. It's a requirement of the working group or interest group. And we have virtual connects and in-person meetings too. So taking advantage of all of these, it's a lot of communication channels to pay attention to, but it's important, I think, to keep on top of these things because you might miss something. But if you miss something, there are plenty of people to ask, and you can ask through these communication channels. Other resources, again, the website, there's the nice wiki link. And then the primary set of GitHub repository or organizations are here. So there's Samvera Labs, which is kind of experimental. Once you get a certain number of adopters of something in labs, it can move into Samvera organization. And there's a Samvera deprecated, which is new to me. And presumably that is filled with things that were deprecated. Go figure. Code licensing. So all Samvera code is available under an Apache license. Code commitments are being managed through contributor license agreement. This is the CLA that you've heard of. Don't be afraid of it. So each developer who is contributing code needs an individual CLA, and if you're an organization that's working in the space, your organization is going to need a corporate CLA. Code contributors maintain ownership of their IP. That's pretty important and may help you talk to the lawyers here. And essentially what you're doing when you sign the CLA is you're granting a non-exclusive license to the project and its users to use that code. We had earlier today another workshop where we had a conversation about difficulties folks have had with getting a corporate CLA signed. And we have a few examples in the community of institutions that have had trouble. And we've found through communication some workarounds to getting CLAs pushed through past kind of, general counsel at an institution that was pretty prickly about the idea. So we have experience doing that kind of thing if your institution is concerned about getting the corporate CLA signed. Now I'll turn it over to Julie.
So do you need to have both the corporate and the individual CLAs signed?
Yeah, so there needs to be one for the institution, and then I don't know whether you need one for every developer or whether you can have a group one. Yeah, so then a developer sends an individual one.
Okay. So the recommendation from our general counsel was to do the corporate CLA, but they were a little hesitant on the individual CLA, and that's why I'm just wondering if it is mandatory or not.
Committing code back to the court,
Okay.
right, Richard?
Yeah.
So the CCLA is really powerful to have in get your institution buy-in. And we think that that tends to work better for community. If you've got your institution aware and buy-in.
I have to say, though, that I think that so one way of thinking about the ICLAs is that essentially if you have a team of people who are working on a Samvera thing, it's probably a good idea to ICLA all of them. I think, even if they're maybe not a software developer. For example, I have my first pull request put into Hyrax. I'm very proud of this because I'm not a software developer. And it was because there was a spelling error on the GitHub issue template for Hyrax. And I kept seeing it, and I wanted to change it. But if I need a CLA for that, right? That's a code contribution essentially. And so there may be little things that people want to do on your team that you would be hobbled if you didn't have a CLA. And so just kind of getting all CLA'd up is probably a good idea.
Could I just quickly say one other thing about the corporate CLA? The corporate CLA really, getting your institution to sign that, is them giving their staff permission to give to Samvera code that has been developed on the institution's time. It's a protection for them against their institution getting very sniffy and disciplinary action, goodness knows what. The individual CLA is to make sure that the individuals know exactly where the IP stands. It remains with them, but as Steve said, it gives us a license to use it in perpetuity as part of the project and to modify it if we see fit and redistribute it and so on.
And I guess I would add that at UVA, I have every single person get a CLA because you never know when you're going to be losing people and you might have an emergency situation and you would want everybody to be able to pitch in.
The CCLA, as people have already noted, can be problematic in the sense that it's likely to end up on your general counsel's desk. Most of them are happy with it, and as Steve has said, we've had to do a couple of workarounds for particular institutions. The ICLA, once that's in place, ICLAs are not a barrier. It takes less than 5 minutes to fill in. It's not a major.
We have people in the room from UCLA. Are you aware of the kind of restrictions? UC San Diego actually worked and got that fixed, so if you want to work with them.
You think UCLA is going to take anything from anyone but UCLA? You haven't learned about the UC system. So
maybe
we
we
ought
could
to
slip
follow.
it through Virginia and hand it off to you.
Yeah, so we have to go through it all over again. I think it's just like old school rivalry between who gets to say what.
I just signed mine without selling legal, so.
No.
Oh, no, I didn't. No, I didn't. Joke.
We'll let it that out.
Right, so moving on. So the next, I'm doing 3 sections now. So we're going to start to look at Hyrax, which is the sort of solution bundle that Steve works an awful lot on and that I work with. So first off, I'm going to show some example sites. Some of these are Hyrax, some aren't. And then we're going to have a hands-on session so people can actually start playing with the software and getting a feel for how it works. And then I'll run through the technical bits of the stack. Because actually, I was jotting down the kind of split of people in the room, and there are quite a few people that I think will be interested in the technology, so I will run through that. So I'll run through these examples now. We can share the links, so if people don't want to do the hands-on, you can sit and look through some of these example sites and just have a play around and a poke around. What we've tried to do is just pick a handful of things that illustrate different types of uses of the Samvera stack. So the first one is Indiana University's Avalon. So Avalon is one of the solution bundles, so it's a multimedia management interface. So Indiana use it themselves, which is good. Got to eat your own dog food. So it's got some really quite specific features for media management. So it's got some of the gated discovery and streaming authentication features, so you can access control what needs to be access controlled. I'm going to run through the examples, and then I'll maybe just quickly show the sites depending on time, because I don't want to eat into coffee. Second example is Alexandria Digital Research Library. I don't think this is Hyrax, but it is a modern Samvera application because it's based on Fedora 4. There are still quite a few people out there running on Fedora 3 because it's quite a big jump from Fedora 3 to Fedora 4. So this is it's a really nice looking site. It's got a real range of content in, and that's I think the kind of interesting thing about this, that it's got this real mix of born digital, digitized content, different stuff in there. And then Earthworks is GIS content. So this is a Stanford piece of software. Again, this is not Hyrax, but this is a very pretty example. It's got maps and stuff, so that's always nice to look at. But it's, so the mapping features in there, it just shows how you can start to extend your application. So you get out of the box some core functionality from a Hyrax or a application built with Samvera pieces. But if you want to augment that, you often find that someone else has done something similar that you can borrow from, or you extend it yourself. So it's all very flexible. This is mine. So the Kingston Digital Archive is running on the Haiku software, which I'm going to mention a little bit when I go through the technical slides. It's a hosted repository by me. It was migrated from ePrints, which is an institutional repository software that's quite heavily used in the UK. I don't think it's widely used anywhere else. It wasn't really best suited to this content because this is digitized publication, so page by page stuff. So this makes heavy use of IFFF and Universal Viewer, so it's got that sort of page turning feel. And then Emory's Theses repository, this is something that DCE, another service provider, worked on with Emory. This is a Hyrax. King's Fund is a Hyrax too, it's got Haiku on top of Hyrax. We'll get onto that when I talk more about the technology. So this is a theses and dissertations repository, heavily focused on student submission, so self-submission and workflow, so there'll be staff review in that. So we've got about 10 minutes, so I'll just skip out the slides and just show one or two. So you tend to be able to kind of tell that you're looking at a Samvera-based repository, but everyone brands them themselves, so sometimes it's quite difficult to know. So this is the Emory dissertations and theses. So if we just go into one of the examples, I can't do the submission obviously because I don't have an account, but you can see, you'll see it if you look through some of the other examples that there's a slight difference in the way things are laid out. One thing that I think is quite interesting about this is right down at the bottom here, this notion of, I don't think this is a very good example because it doesn't have it. Oh, it does, yeah. So it has this notion of the primary PDF, which is the thesis file, and the supplemental files. So this is an extension of how Hyrax would normally deal with files because it treats all the files the same. So that's quite a nice example of how it's been extended to meet a particular use case, which is a very common one really around theses. And then you can see, looking above, you can see some metadata here that's obviously very tailored to a thesis. King's Fund, like I say, this is a Hyrax using the Haiku software. It's, if I just click on one of these, I'll find an interesting one. So this is all health content, so some of it's a bit strange, but King's Fund are a UK charity that do health-related research, and they've published an awful lot of reports and such like, and many of those have been digitized. So this is a digitized content repository, and my favorite is, there's hundreds of hospital beds. Just if I select one, it'll just load up the Universal Viewer. Scroll down while that's loading. You can see that, again, the metadata here has been tailored more for publication, so it's got things like publication date, publisher, place of publication. Got the files down at the bottom. But the main thing with this is this heavy use of Universal Viewer, so you can go page by page through the contents, and we also extended this to support in item searching. So if I search for an item, it will highlight the text on the page. Earthworks is just really pretty. Look. But I think maps are really nice to look at. But you can see down here that you've got this sort of searchable area, so you can highlight areas and search within them. This uses Leaflet and OpenStreetMap, which is really nice. Anyone who uses Google Maps for anything like this will know that Google have just started to charge. So this is a nice example of using proper open technologies for doing mapping. And it's similar to the others. It's got the same style of search and display, the faceted searching, but with this kind of added loveliness of mapping, which is, I think, really nice. And this one's Alexandria. So I really like the look of this one. I've always liked this one. There's lots of browse options here, so we can look at, say, format, so we can look for different types of content. Again, you can see a similar feel to it, and this is the underlying software. So we can look at some images. So this one's got lots and lots of content in. This is also using, I think this is not Universal Viewer, this is OpenSeaDragon, but it's the same sort of experience of this deep zoom technology where you can look at this nice cow. And again, metadata down the bottom. And again, you can see nice little things where this copyright logo is not a standard feature in Samvera, so it's been customized. And the code for, I think, all of these, all of them is all available publicly. So this is another nice thing about the community, that when you see a nice example, you can often go and find the code and have a poke around. And if you give due credit, people don't mind you borrowing bits of their code to reuse. And then finally, you've got the Avalon, which is the moving image collections. So this, as I said earlier, is very tailored to let's see if I can find something that looks interesting. That's what a bit of Dan sleeps. So this is tailored to audiovisual content. So obviously, I've not signed into any of these, so some of the tailored features are sitting behind, but you can see this has got a slightly different kind of visual feel to it. So this is Avalon. The viewer here is a big part of what the Avalon guys have worked on, making sure you can stream and render video really nicely. I don't know what's going to happen if I play this. Oh yeah, that's working really cleanly. So there you go, some dance steps. And I think I'm going to leave this woman dancing while everyone goes for a cup of coffee. So I think coffee's served around 3, so it gives you a few minutes to get there. After coffee, we'll do a hands-on. So we've got a demo instance of the software that everyone can sign up and start submitting objects and looking at how the search works. And I think hopefully during that'll throw up various questions that you'll all have about your own use cases, and we can answer those. Like I said before, if anyone doesn't want to do the hands-on, they can just pick up these examples and start having a look around. And then I'll walk through the technical infrastructure, and then Robin will finish up by talking more about the kind of advocacy and selling open source at your institution and the pitch. So thanks very much. Any questions on that little bit that I've just done there?
Do you know of any institutions who are using a variety of types of presentation for different kinds of content, like, Avalon for audio and video, and an image viewer for images, and, something else for multimedia, and, what that might look like at another,
And I can definitely sit down. I don't think our things are going to be much different than the examples that Julie's pulled together, because we have Avalon, and we're using the universal viewer for some of the images where you can pan and zoom, and those are actually embedded in Blacklight. And then you have the ETDs and open access that are different, but those are submission only, and we use Blacklight and pull everything into view. So I'm happy to do a one-on-one for that stuff, but I think she's got some of the freshest and newest things up. for
Yeah,
those
but there's-
examples.
Yeah, there are obviously more.
I know the Avalon team right now, and as they're working on Avalon 7, are working on implementation of different viewers based on what type of work you're depositing. So that could kind of move in the direction of what it sounds like you're thinking about. And when we get into the hands-on, we'll talk about work types and things like that, I imagine. So that might become a little bit clearer of what that looks like.
And also, if you want to pick out a different streaming service, we licensed a different streaming service for Avalon and plugged it right in. It's flexible that way.
You might be talking about this later when you talk about the technological infrastructure, but isn't Avalon moving to Hyrax, and what does that mean?
It is, so that will mean that Avalon will become more like Haiku, which is a sort of a thinner layer of functionality that specialises a Hyrax, that sits on top of Hyrax. And I think the really powerful thing in that is, at the moment, you've kind of got this either or, Hyrax or Avalon, but for this very use case that Lucy's just described, you'll be able to have Avalon and other content types, other sort of use types within the same architecture. So yes, that is happening. I don't know what the time scale is for that. I think work has started. Do you know? Yeah.
Need in the community, like even at UVA, we're starting to get audio and video files submitted as supplemental files with ETDs. So you don't want to have multiple audio video infrastructure scattered everywhere that you have to patch and upkeep. So moving it into Hyrax is going to give you a much better components.
Strategic reason for making things thinner, though?
What's the strategic reason for making things thinner? I'm repeating your question for our friends online. Why would they do that? I think part of it is that, I mean, you'll have to ask the Avalon team that question, but I suspect that part of what's going on is that there's so much overlap in functionality between an Avalon and a Hyrax that if the overlap area can be kind of maintained by Hyrax, that Avalon really only needs to focus on the things that make Avalon different from Hyrax, right? So this is kind of converging resourcing into one core platform, Hyrax, that then allows the Avalon team to specialize the Avalon-y things about their product.
Yes, so strategically, if you think about having, or I should say architecturally, if you have one application that needs AV, but you're using the same streaming service, whether it's for the AV portal or for the electronic theses and dissertations that have supplemental audio-video files, you're not duplicating infrastructure, if that makes sense.
I think the more altruistic one as well is that at the moment, if a feature is added to Avalon that is also valuable to Hyrax, the users of Hyrax don't get it. But when Avalon sort of shrinks, those developers will be contributing into Hyrax, so those new features will be available to much more people. And like Steve said, it's really about reducing duplication, because I think right now, if you kind of took apart Avalon, took apart Hyrax, you'll see an awful lot of duplication across the two. And if you can kind of reduce that, you can actually get more done. Any more questions? So if folks come back in around 20 minutes, but if you get like busy in conversation down there, don't worry too much. We'll just get started at maybe about 25 past. So yeah, so if folks go to this link, it should work. So the idea of this next bit is really just to give you a feel for Hyrax. So those of you who've not used it before, I think. So if you click on the logo in the upper left corner, that'll take you back to the home page. And then you'll see in the middle there's a button that says share your work. So this is where you can start to submit items. So the first step we're going to do today is get everyone to submit, a handful of items. This version of the repository is configured with a workflow, which means when you submit your items, they won't go to the live repository straight away. So once we've all kind of done this bit, I'll talk a little bit about workflows, and then I can make a bunch of you admins and you can start approving items to be made available. So yeah, this should be self-explanatory. If you're having problems, just raise your hand and one of us will come around.
What are we doing? Where are we? What is this thing that we logged into? Did you say already?
So this is an instance of Hyrax. Okay. Yeah, did I not say that? Sorry.
I don't know. I didn't hear that.
So yeah, this is it's a demo Hyrax that we built just for the conference, and it's running on the latest version of Hyrax, which is version 2.3.3, and it has been configured with 2 work types, just using the standard out-of-the-box Hyrax basic metadata.
And I guess I would ask those of you that are not actually doing the demo stuff, if you could go through some of the other information and write down your questions that you have. We'd really like to have a lot of question and answer at the end.
And I know everyone works at different speeds, so you know, feel free to just kind of play around, have a look at the dashboard, have a look at the searches and the collections, submit more items if you want to, try different file types, try multiple files. So please feel free to kind of go off script a little bit. Just, you know, have a look around the dashboard, look at the list of the works you've created, look at the actions.
I have a question. Should I create a collection before I add a object?
No, you don't have to. If you want to create a collection, you can create a collection, but there's no requirement to put things into collections.
Can I create a collection later?
Yes. Because this is configured with the one-step workflow where things need approving, I'm going to go through and start approving people's items. You should see notifications about that. There's a little bell icon in the top bar, which should have a little number on if there's actions happening. And also there's a notifications panel in the dashboard under, I think it's under your activity. Yes. So the notifications there, so that'll give you kind of notifications when things have been approved and so on. So I'm just going to spin through and approve the things that have been coming through. Please feel free to carry on while I'm talking, but I'll just talk a little bit about kind of what's happening, and I'm going to show the admin dashboard. So you can see now we're starting to get these fantastic resources coming through. So have a play around and search how all that works. We've got 6 lovely items. I particularly like this pizza. You'll see that, I mean, we've got quite a few image resources coming through. You'll see that with image resources, you get the universal viewer, and that's a default. It's configurable in Hyrax, so if you don't want that, you can switch it off in the actual underlying application. But if it's configured, then any item that is an image will automatically be displayed using Universal Viewer. And there will be some metadata in the side. And I think it's important to note that if you're building your own application with Hyrax, a hell of a lot of this is configurable. So you can change the required fields when you submit metadata. You can create your own work types. You can change the metadata. You can add new fields. You can change what an item has. I've done loads of work on metadata work types, so I've defined works for sort of journal article, publication. So it's incredibly flexible. And there is a community documentation repository at samvera.github.io. Is that? There was a yes. Thanks, Richard. And that's got loads of really good documentation in, and it's got a really good section about how to add new metadata and change all the different bits of the system that you need to change to do that. So just on the topic of workflow, so I'm just going to log in. So any of you who've already had a look at the dashboard will notice that you don't see all of this. You just see kind of this bit. You don't see all this bit. So admin users, I'm an admin in the system, so admin users see much more in the back end, and there's quite a lot of stuff we can configure. We'll see how we get on for time. I might go through some more things, but given that I've set up the workflow, I was just going to talk a little bit about how that works. So Hyrax has a concept called administrative sets, and that is a particular type of collection. And the admin sets are used essentially to apply, I guess, a default set of behaviors to a particular set of things. So I just go into this. So in this system, there's only one. We could have multiple ones. But if I go into this admin set and edit it, you can see that there's these tabs along the top. So there's metadata, but the second one is about participants. So there are different people that can actually manage this collection. So at the moment, all registered users can deposit to this admin set, and just repository administrators can manage this set. Now I could add individuals as managers, I could add different groups as managers, so this is all configurable. Release and visibility sets things like, is there a default visibility for each item that goes in? Do you set everything to public? Can you only choose public? So the default behavior is this one, which is just depositor can choose the visibility that they want. And then similar with release, which is embargoes and leases, the default is allow people to do that themselves. But you can create these administrative sets and have different defaults. So you can apply certain controls. But the workflow one is the one I was going to talk about. So out of the box, Hyrax comes with 2 workflows. The default workflow is just you submit something and it goes live straight in the repository. That's the simplest case. And that case works well for institutions who only have kind of library staff or submitters, sort of trained submitters using the system. So the King's Fund example that I used earlier, it's only the King's Fund library staff that will have accounts on the system, so they don't need any other workflow. That's fine for them. So the second one is the one I've enabled here because I think this is the more common case for your sort of institutional repository users. And this has a single review step. So a registered user can submit, and then a person with the status of reviewer gets a notification and reviews that item. Oops. So just to show you how that works. So this review submissions panel will provide the user with a list of items that need reviewing, and then also in the second tab a list of things that have already been reviewed. You guys have been really, really busy. I can't keep up. And then just to show you how this works. So, this is just because the back end hasn't finished processing the image yet. That's not actually a problem. So up at the top here, we get this orange panel if you've got the ability to do the review and approval. And then there are three possible actions. You can request changes. So you can send it back to the user and say, you need to add more metadata, or you didn't fill this out right, or whatever. You can just make a comment. I'm not quite sure why you'd want to. I guess you'd use that if something was already approved. I suppose that's the thing. So if you needed to you'd approved an item, but down the line you wanted to kind of feedback some extra comments. You know, someone's emailed in to say they've got more information about this image, that kind of thing. And then approve, of course, is the one that will make the item live. And you can add a comment here, but you don't have to. So if I submit that, the amazing cat in a bowl that's not finished processing yet is live in the system. So that's workflow. I can make people admins if you want to have a play with that approval step. Or actually, I created an admin user, which I will just pop in here. Let's look. anyone wants to have a play with the actual workflow approval stuff, feel free to log out and log back in with this account. Did you want to say something? Yeah. Oh yeah, because you're the work.
Yeah. So out of the box Hyrax comes with a no-step workflow that self-deposit with no approval, and a one-step workflow. The workflow engine in Hyrax allows for arbitrarily complex workflows, which sounds really dangerous, right? And there's probably room in the community for discussion about how people have implemented workflows on Hyrax. I know that at Oregon State University, we have self-deposit, one-step, and a two-step workflow. And as soon as we started to construct that two-step workflow, it became really hard to visualize what was actually going on with the workflow. And so it takes a little bit of puzzling over to make sure your workflow doesn't have things like dead ends that don't allow you to get back out and things like that. But you can customize workflows all you want, which is helpful for things like I deposit a metadata library and reviews the metadata, and then somebody approves it to make it live in the system, for example. So there's flexibility there.
One use case that we've talked about is where you've got like an automated process that adds, say, images from a digitization process. So they come in without any metadata, and then they might go through a QA and then a metadata addition step. So I think there are use cases, but when we talk to people about workflows, we discourage long, complex workflows and encourage one-step ones if possible.
Can you have varying kinds of workflows, like, librarian ingests a batch of images and those go right in, but students self-deposit?
Yes, yes.
Their ETDs and those are mediated.
Yeah, so I described admin sets before. So an admin set has a one-to-one relationship with a workflow, so you can have multiple admin sets. So you might have an admin set for library deposits, and they've got the straight to live workflow, and that's where the deposit by that set of users go by default. And then you might have a second admin set, and the participants in that admin set are your thesis students, and then that has the one-step mediation. So yes, you can. So just moving on to some of the other things, so I think we looked at this one. So searching and faceting, I'm guessing people have been having a play with that, but if anyone's set different visibility on their resources, like public, University of London, or private, you'll notice if you log out and search that you won't see as many things. You'll see the facets down the left-hand side. Again, all this can be configured in your own Hyrax repository. You can add facets, you can remove facets. There's quite a nice blacklight plugin that will do a nice little date slider, sort of a range filter for dates. One thing I think we have mentioned is that the search bit of Hyrax uses Blacklight, which is another open source tool for a discovery interface piece of software. Again, it's open source. Again, it's community supported. Again, it's an example of why build something in Hyrax when there is already something out there. It might be slightly harder to pull it in than building it direct, but you get lots more benefit because every time Blacklight is enhanced, you get those enhancements. Things that aren't available by default but can be made available in Hyrax are things like Blacklight's bookmark feature and its search history feature. And then if you want to add more works, go ahead. And then I'm just going to go back, because I think we've got about another 10 minutes, so feel free to carry on, but I think I'll go back and talk a little bit more about the admin features. Collections went through a major overhaul earlier this year under a working group called the Collections Extensions. collections extensions defined a concept called collection types. So it's possible to define multiple collection types in Hyrax. Again, out of the box there are two. So there is the admin set, that's a specialist type of collection, and there is a user collection, which is, as it sounds, a collection that you as an individual would create. Like other items, you've got the same sorts of controls on collections, so you can make them public, restricted, or private. There's also ad hoc sharing, so you could create a collection and share it with a small group of people by adding user accounts or groups. To define new collection types, there's a panel down in the settings section down here. When defining a new collection type, I'll just call this test. You've got a bunch of things you can configure. I think this one is kind of the coolest. This is kind of the core of what collections extensions was about. So you can have collections that can be nested or not. So that allows you to build things like a university organizational structure in collections in the way that some software like DSpace already does. And that was the use case there was, I think, particularly driven by people migrating from DSpace. You can allow collections to be branded, so you can add a banner graphic and a thumbnail icon. You can allow collections to be discoverable. That means they'll turn up in search results or not. You can allow sort of sharing and have that inherited down to new works. So you can really restrict a collection down to just a kind of an individual's own collection with none of this, or you can really open it up to lots of different features. Multiple membership is another one, being able to add items to multiple collections or not. So, and then again, participants, which we saw in when I was looking at admin sets, so you can define who can scroll button who can manage and create items in a particular collection, and then you can change the badge color, which we all like changing colors. So I'll change that to a nice dark purple. And once you've defined a new collection type, when you click on the new collection, you get another option to choose. And the screen real estate here is very similar to the add new collections one here, so it's quite familiar in the way people use them. And then if I just hop quickly over to the interface, by default, this is the way the homepage is by default, so you get this sort of featured works. So anyone who's tried logging in as an admin should be able to go to a work and click on the button to feature it, and then it would appear here. And on the other side, you get this Explore Collections feature, which will list the different collections that are available to that logged in user. So because I'm an admin here, it's all of them. But for others, you won't see quite so many. This is my collection, pictures of dogs. And then this admin dashboard has really come on in the last kind of couple of years, lots of new features. Quite a lot of those features came in via the Haiku project. So the Haiku project worked on various features and then it pushed them down into Hyrax so that everyone could benefit, which is kind of coming back to that discussion we had earlier about Avalon. So under settings, there's a few things that the administrators configure. They can change some of the appearance. They can add some of the content to various static pages, so the about page, help page, deposit agreement, and terms of use. And this is nice because it means you don't have to go back to your developers to say, can you just change that typo on that page? So these are putting the power into the hands of the administrator, which I think is really, really nice. And then this features panel here allows you to flip certain features on and off. So again, this allows you to tailor the repository to your particular use cases. So features I've not mentioned before, but there's a proxy deposit feature which allows you to assign someone the right to deposit on your behalf. You can toggle that off so people can't do that. The ability to transfer works, which is useful, if people leave the institution. Again, you can toggle it off. One or two others, you can turn off the deposit agreement on creation of works. That's useful if your use case is that it's just trained up staff that are doing deposits. They don't need to be clicking on a accept deposit agreement every time. You can turn off the batch upload feature. You can turn off you can turn on, this is off by default. So when you've got private files attached to an object, it used to be the default behavior that you'd see all the files listed, but all the private ones would just not be available. So this now by default doesn't show those if you don't have the right to see them. You can toggle it on if you want people to be aware that there's a file that they can't access. And again, there was a community discussion. Some wanted it, some didn't want it, so it went in as a feature flipper so people can have what they want. And I think that's most of the main features. When you were submitting, you'll have probably seen there was the embargoes and leases feature. So there's a admin panel here where you can look at the embargoed items that are up for release, and you can manually release them. I think I'm right in saying that this is not automated, because many institutions want to kind of manually check that something should be released when it's reached the date. But you could have a scheduled task that went through and released them automatically if that's what you wanted in your repository. Similar with leases. So with embargoes you restrict something for a period, and with leases you make it available for a period and then you restrict it at the end. I think for me the main use case for leases is if you're putting on, say, an online exhibition and you've licensed some images from a particular museum or gallery for, say, 3 years. You set a lease, they'll show in the repository for those 3 years, and then they'll revert back to admin or whatever you've set them to revert back to at the end. And I think that's most of the features. Do people have any questions? Have you gotten okay with the site? I'll take that as a yes. Do people get as far as trying to create collections and adding items? Good, that's great. And the community's always welcomes feedback. So if you found things hard or stuff wasn't intuitive, you can feed that back individually. You can put it on Slack. You can create an issue in the GitHub. So there's lots of ways of feeding back comments. But the better thing is to feedback and then fix it. That's what we really want. So we've got, is everyone happy that they've finished with their hands-on? So the next bit of the presentation is, I'm just going to delete that password because this is public. I was going to run through the technology. Find the slides. So the plan now is I will run through these for maybe 10 minutes. Robin will talk for 15, 20 minutes about the pitch, the advocacy side, and then. You have plenty of time. Yeah, I won't take too long. I've talked enough. And then we're going to have about half an hour at the end for more discussion. So hopefully people have got some good questions. So these are the major components of a Hyrax application. So for those of you that aren't kind of interested in the technology, feel free to have an app or keep playing with the demo sites. But so the key components of a Samvera repository, e.g. Hyrax, there essentially are three. So Fedora is the repository solution. So that's where the data and the metadata goes and is stored stored and managed. Solar is the index. Solar is what drives that fast search and allows us to have all those facets and that very rich search experience. So everything that goes into Fedora, metadata will be then indexed into Solar. Solar is essentially a cache. So if Solar were to just be accidentally deleted, you can always rebuild that. The really valuable thing is here, Fedora, that's storing your assets. And then Samvera is kind of all this stuff. I think I'm going to move on to the next slide because I think this is explained quite well in some of the other slides. So I'm going to unpick that box full of yellow things and the red bit at the top a bit later on. So Fedora. stands for Flexible, Extensible, Durable Object Repository Architecture. It's been around for quite a long time, 13 years. The key things about it is it's flexible. You can put anything in it. It's completely content agnostic. It's extensible, so it's easy to kind of augment it with different apps and services. And it's durable, so it's not a full-on digital preservation system, but it's doing the right things to allow you to do preservation with the content you put in it. So it's got some little tools and features that allow for some preservation action. There are many adopters of Fedora beyond the Samvera community, and it's been through 4 major releases, so we're currently on Fedora 4. It sits within the DuraSpace Foundation, so it's one of the 3 projects that they look after, so DSpace and Vivo are the other 2. So it's got this kind of solid looked after base, and it also has a community and a funding model. Just a quick note on Fedora 4, that came out in December 2014. It was a major rewrite, so it's incompatible with Fedora 3. And because of that, there is still a long tail of people who have not yet migrated, because it's quite a bit of work to migrate. Current release is 4.75, that came out in February. It's been a while because work has shifted towards Fedora 5. So Fedora 5 is currently in development. Fedora 5 will be compatible with Fedora 4. Fedora 5 is really about an API specification. So Fedora 4 gave you an out-of-the-box Fedora that you could deploy on your system. Fedora 5 is about extracting the core functionality into an API so that you can have multiple implementations of Fedora to meet different use cases. And that will be great, I think, when we start to see different implementations, because you can go from, someone with not very much to look after could simply have some text files full of metadata and files on a file store as their implementation, right through to someone who needs something that can store massive terabytes of data in a cloud provider. So it'll give a real level of flexibility. Rails, for those of you that don't know, it's a web application development framework. It's been around for quite a long time now. It's used quite heavily for database-driven web applications. So a few examples here: GitHub, Airbnb. It is very wedded to being testable, and that's really important because in the Samvera community, you can't commit code into a Samvera code base without a test, and tests give you that knowledge that you're not breaking some of the functionality with a change you've made. So it makes it very powerful and much easier to automate. And I didn't write this. I'm not sure it can be learned in a week, but whoever wrote this. But it can be learned quite quickly. There is a lot of good resources out there. Stanford went from 1 to 8 Ruby developers in a year without hiring anyone new. Who has 8 developers except Stanford? But yeah, you can. We've got a junior developer at the moment who he was learning Python, and I said, learn Rails, we're going to use it for Samvera, and he's really enjoying it, and he's making great progress. So it is learned. Rails is quite convention-based, so one of the things that I like about Rails that some developers hate is that it kind of does magic. If you name a file in a particular way, something magic happens, and that's something that can take a while to get your head around, but it's really helpful because it does quite a lot of grunt work for you. So Hyrax, as we've mentioned quite a few times, Hyrax is what we call a repository engine. So it's not a repository, it's a toolkit or an engine from which you build your repository. It's got lots and lots of nice features we've just seen. It supports objects based on PCDM, which I'll come back to in another slide. And it evolved from an earlier project called Sophia and another one called Curation Concerns. So Sophia was one of the most actively maintained and widely used gems, and it's still got a lot of users who have not yet transitioned. But a little bit like the Avalon Hyrax discussion we had earlier, you'd got Curation Concerns and Sophia doing overlapping things and slightly different things, so the community decided to bring those together into one sort of more powerful central thing. Haiku, again, I think we have mentioned this a few times already. So Haiku was a project involving Stanford, DPLA, Duraspace. I think that's just those three, to build basically a turnkey repository solution based on Hyrax. So as of now, the Haiku code is available. People can deploy it as a do-it-yourself repository. There are a number of service providers that will host it as well. The project put a lot of work into making it deployable in different ways. So there's a Docker compose, there is AWS scripts. So that's really neat for anyone who needs to deploy these things. And it also had a multi-tenancy. So it's got a configuration where you can switch multi-tenancy on and off. Multi-tenancy means you can host multiple repositories in the same application. And that's really powerful. So I'll talk a little bit more about the stack. So if you remember that first slide, the bit at the bottom was Fedora and Solar. On top of that is Active Fedora. So if anyone has done any Rails development, you've probably used Active Record. So Active Record is the way a Rails application talks to a database, and Active Fedora is the way a Rails application talks to Fedora. So it kind of apes the features that Active Record has. And that means rather than having to worry about how you create objects in Fedora, your developers can focus on the features up at the top. On top of Active Fedora, there is Hydra PCDM. I think we've not changed its name, so that there's a few little bits of Hydra still in the community code bases. So PCDM is a common data model. It's been around for probably 4 or 5 years now. So the idea of that is it allows us to have a common understanding of how our metadata, well, objects, not so much metadata, our objects sort of fit together. And it simplifies the creation of these complex works and collections. So just a quick interlude into PCDM. So if anyone is interested, so it's actually a really simple data model, and this is, I think, what makes it powerful.
I thought, back up one slide. You have Hydra. Hydra is no more, right?
Yeah, but there's still, so there are still some of the code is still got Hydra in its name because of the kind of grunt work of renaming actual core components in the code. So you will see Hydra a little bit still around in the GitHub code, but the community name is Samvera. So PCDM is a really simple data model that basically says you can have a collection can have many objects in it, a collection can be a member of a collection, an object can have many files in it, and it can have related files, and an object can have another object as a member of it. So it just provides us with quite simple shared vocabulary for talking about our works. And then it can get really complicated when you start modeling. So this is just an example of how you might model a multi-page book in PCDM. So you've got all this kind of creating the number, the order of items in the. So there's a book up at the top. Here's each page. This is maintaining the order. I'm not going to go into detail in this. And then the objects have different files, and those files might be things like an image of a page, a preservation image of a page.
So is PCDM a separate component that needs to be implemented, or is it?
If you use Hyrax, it's there.
It's there in
Yeah.
Hyrax.
Sorry if that wasn't clear. So I'm building up a picture of how you get to Hyrax really here.
Okay.
So yeah, if I back up a little bit, sometimes you forget. Kind of, you think everyone knows everything, and they don't. So basically, Hyrax is an amalgam of components that are maintained by the community. So Active Fedora is the one that talks to Fedora. PCDM is the one that specifies the data model. The next one up, I'm going to move on from this. So the next one up is this thing called Hydra Works, and that has a bunch of different functionality in it around characterizing files, deriving derivatives, So all of these kind of pieces, you can.
Sorry, should I shout out or? This is so tiny, it's not really worth it. But
For somebody who's learning, I think these dots are not just in between Hydra and PCDM. It's not just that was the pretty graphic. It's something from Rails, right? Like it's,
These.
it's a syntax thing,
Yeah,
right?
the dots are, yeah. It's just the name of the. It's kind of the name of the code. So this kind of says the kind of. Actually, I'd put an underscore, but it sort of means that Hydra works. I'm trying to think what.
is like Hydra the big bucket and PCDM like a little component, and then the other one.
I didn't do these slides. I would have done it like this in camel case because the code itself is called Hydra PCDM and the code is called Hydra Works. Okay. The dot really just means an inheritance. Yeah, Hydra is the bigger, but that's actually not, I don't think that's true in this case. Not my slides. Oops, wrong way. Yeah, so.
Every little thing you can use to sort of decode what's happening is helpful. And I've seen that when I've been working with people and nobody will explain it, and then I finally learned it's from Rails. It's a syntax thing, and
we do tend, I think, to talk, to because it's the language you write, and you tend to use the simple. It's like using the camel case there is because if you were using Active Fedora in the code, that's how you'd include it because that.
That's its name.
Yeah,
right? That's its name.
The file, the underlying files would be like lowercase with an underscore. So this is all like Rails conventions. So the class name would be that. The file name would be underscores and small letters. So yeah, and we do tend to use all these kind of conventions. So yeah, so if you wanted to build a Samvera repository of your own, you can do it with just these. So if you don't need all the features that are in Hyrax, you can pick at any level here, but from the Hydra Works level, you can build a fully functioning repository, but you won't get a lot of the features that are already in Hyrax. And that's a local decision. Do you need those features? Is your use case so different that you want to just stop at this Works level and build an application from there? Because if you deployed a Hydra Works application, you'd still get blacklight, you'd still get some level of submission. So Hyrax is in a sense optional, but what Hyrax brings is quite a lot of stuff. So it brings you those user and admin dashboards. It brings you the upload locally and via cloud providers. It brings you some citation integration, so you can pull out, say, EndNote references, and it embeds Google Scholar tags in the pages. It builds in some of these file auditing and versioning capabilities, so you can replace a version of a file and it maintains the original, and it lets you roll back to that original if you've made a mistake. And that's relying directly on Fedora features, but it's implemented in Hyrax. It gives you the access control that we've looked at, and the leases embargoes, and a bunch of other features that are being added all the time, like the IFFF and universal viewer support.
Plugin for the user and administration.
There is, so...
Is there an LDAP plugin for the user and admin dashboard?
So there's a gem called Devise, which is not just a Samvera gem, it's a Rails gem that is used for managing that sort of user login. And there are plugins for Devise for most of your major single sign-on. So LDAP, Shibboleth, OmniAuth, which will support the Google standard. So yeah, out of the box it just comes with in-application user account creation, but a lot of people have overridden that. There's the Shibboleth configuration. I did like a test implementation, and it didn't take long, just a few hours to get that configured. So so you kind of expected to need to do that. So it's a pretty standard thing, and you'd get help from the community if you were wanting to do that. So, yeah, and on the top then sits your application. And like I say, your application can come in here, and in theory it can come in even lower if you only need some of the functionality. yeah, so that was it for the technical. Is there any, I hope that made sense to everyone, and if there's any questions, you know, you go ahead now, ask them at the end. No, go ahead. We're keeping Robin fit.
I hope you all don't mind. I tend to ask questions to just try to keep a dialogue going.
This is exactly what we wanted from the
Okay,
session.
so several times during the previous presentations, you mentioned having Haiku on top of Hyrax, and I had, before I met you, thought they were alternatives to each other. So could you sort of talk about that version of the technical details before you get into this part, or you want to save it for later? That's totally fine.
I can do that now. So I think I mentioned earlier that Hyrax is, I kind of describe it as a toolkit. It's not a repository. You kind of, you create an application on top of Hyrax. And that's the thing you'll tailor to your needs and add features to. So Haiku is that. It's an application that's using all the Hyrax functionality, and it adds actually a relatively small number of features. So it adds multi-tenancy, it adds some group management, and I think most of the other things that were done in Haiku have actually come down into the core Hyrax stack. Does that answer your question?
I think so.
So there's a kind of difference between a gem and an application. So what
lost me.
So
although I would like a gem.
So bits of Rails and Ruby functionality are generally packaged up into what's called a gem, and an application is, you know, the Alexandria example, the King's Fund example, they're all Rails applications that make use of various gems and engines. Engines is another word that gets used. So Hyrax is one of those. It's a bunch of functionality that you can pull into your Rails application. And Haiku is a Rails application that pulls in that Hyrax functionality. Did that make sense, Steve? Good. Any more before? Yeah, you can.
So I guess it'd be helpful to have a little more clarification for the application part of it. So I understand Hyrax is a gem, and it goes in your gem file, and it's one of the things that gets installed. So when you say an application, is that, because you're not necessarily customizing or doing anything to Hyrax itself, you're customizing other things that are outside of the gems. So I guess I don't want to get too technical and too into the weeds, but I guess I'm trying to get understanding of at what layer does the application actually sit? Is it, like, it's not a gem, but it's something else. So like, I know you don't want to modify Hyrax code, you don't want to modify a lot of those things because then you get into a fork.
Yeah.
But so at what point and at what level and like where does that customization actually happen? Because I'm assuming you're writing your own Ruby code somewhere.
Yeah.
Is that what you're doing? And then that sits inside of your project directory. Yep. I guess, at what point are you forking something, and at what point are you just creating like an application?
So let me bring, so I'm going to give you an example and hope this helps. So this is the Haiku code. So as you already know that in your gem file it lists all of the different gems and components that you're going to deploy when you deploy your application. So if you want to override some Hyrax behavior, I'll give you an example of where this has been done here. So Rails applications have this particular structure. You always have app, you always have config. So I'll not go into too much details here. But so if I go into here, because I was looking at this the other day, views. Let me think now. Dashboard, I think. Hyrax. Dashboard. So Hyrax has a file called sidebar HTML.lb. And if you were to deploy a Hyrax application based on Hyrax, you wouldn't have that file. So if you wanted to do special things in the dashboard, you'd basically, pull the files up and override them. And there are different ways of doing that. And basically, the idea is you override as little as you possibly can. So if you were overriding an actual, like a Ruby file, you'd like super class, and you'd just override the particular method. So the kind of rule, I guess my rule of thumb is don't fork, because once you fork, you're always battling to keep up to date with the thing you've forked. So I think you override as little as you possibly can up at the top, and have a test suite, so that when the underlying bits are updated, you run your tests, and then that should show you if anything that's changed in the underlying application breaks your functionality.
So I guess when you're creating a Hyrax Rails application, or an application that's based on a Hyrax engine,
yes,
you're essentially creating custom configuration that meets your needs? Is that more
configuration and code and features? It kind of depends the extent to which. I mean, if all you want out of Hyrax is what is offered in the core functionality, but you want to brand it a little bit, you're only really overriding, well, you're not even overriding, you're adding local JavaScript and local CSS, and adding your own models. You need to generate your own models from the underlying Hyrax. And that might be as little as you need to do, but you'd still have to have that application code base. If you want to do more than that, you might be adding your own gems. So we maintain like a vanilla Hyrax, but it has a couple of gems that we've created, and they'll add some utility tasks and some importers for like ePrints data. And so Rails is kind of this web of stuff that you build up.
Okay.
And I kind of try and observe this thing of override as little as you can, because if it changes in the underlying code base, there is no easy way of necessarily knowing it's changed. But that's why you have your tests.
Okay. And so whereas if you were to go with Haiku, that's your application, and a lot of choices and decisions have been made for you, and either you just sort of go with it, or you could make other changes, but then you're kind of getting away from what Haiku actually is.
You can. So yes, so Haiku has its own opinions, but for the King's Fund example, that's Haiku, but we have configured that. We've added different models, and the way I do that is I use a Rails concept called generators. So I can redeploy that application by saying, clone Haiku, run these generation scripts, and here's my repository. So there's no fork. And the actual base repository is not really maintained anywhere. I just know I can rebuild it. So that's kind of my approach. Some people don't like generators, so that's kind of, as with all technology, there's multiple ways of doing things, but that's the way I tend to do it, so that we can maintain this very thin little gem that just generates the application that we need.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you've got to talk fast now. But I mean, this is it. I mean, this is exactly what we wanted. We wanted people to ask the questions that help them to understand the software and the community better.
So over the years, people have asked a lot about, how do we pitch this? How do we pitch it to our organization? How do we pitch it to our developers? And what I would say is you can't come up with just one elevator pitch. You have to have several, and it's wisest to have that tailored to who you're trying to get on board. So if you're talking to a dean or a CIO, you want to talk about how is this going to save you resources? How much resources will it cost? And how would it lower your risk? So some of the things that I've been actually using in my pitch to a dean or a CIO is talking about some of the cross-training that you have to do and some of the turnover. So libraries in particular can have a lot of turnover, and they can have limited resources. So actually working in the Samvera community, I've lost as much as half of my staff and been able to hire people back in, some with Rails experience, some not, get them plugged into the community, and the core framework has continued to evolve even when I've been, like maybe out of resources to focus on that for 6 to 9 months. So they automatically get plugged back in. I was talking at the break with someone that said, oh, I put this question out, and this guy at your institution was really great about talking with me about how to solve this problem. And other people, for that individual in my shop, other people in the community have done the same for him. It's a really good network to plug in, and it also gives individuals who are part of this community people to get together and test out ideas, work together to accomplish something and really come out of it on the other end with better. I talk about risk. So if we have people that come in and write applications, there's a lot of people out there who say you shouldn't have any developers in your organization. Central to UVA, core IT, has gone largely away from having people with software engineering skill and have gone to buying almost everything off the shelf. Libraries do buy a lot of things off the shelf, but for the things that are handling our digital assets and need to be more responsive to changes and sometimes provide functionality where there's not a vended product out there to actually do the thing that we need, at least that we can afford. So we lower our risk by not building in-house applications that when that person leaves, no one knows how to run. And by having that community take those solutions and continue to develop. Content specialists, they're really worried about flexibility and looking at what we can do to reduce barriers for effective asset management preservation. So people at the content specialist level are really interested in having more control over their assets and how they describe them and the tools that they're using, and we're able to actually have the flexibility to tailor these applications in the way that would help content specialists across our community. I've talked a little bit about the churn. I would say at the beginning, in 2010, I was in a room with 10 people who saw the possibility of what this could become. And in the early days, coming out of that primordial goop, it was a little rough. It's like if you were standing up the first Hydra stack, as we did for our institution repository, it was really kind of a prototype. It was to test with our university and figure out what they really wanted, and then be able to come back with the community and build out something that was much stronger than a prototype and more production-oriented. These days, things have reached the maturity point where you're starting to see these solution bundles that offer a lot of functionality. When we talked about Avalon, Avalon was built and to serve a very specific purpose, but over time, those of us who adopted Avalon could see like there's a real benefit in bringing that back in line with one stack that we maintain as a community. So we actually have ended up sort of coming to a point that we wanted to be in for several years, and right now we're in that situation where we have like a lot of maturity in the code and in the community, and many less silos, as you saw earlier. With the developers, I get a lot of pushback from developers who say, well, the Rails libraries have been out there forever and they're sustainable. It's like they're more sustainable than what we're building as a community, but that's not actually true because the developers can still end up doing things in a very boutique way, which is fine if we don't have any other software out there to do that. And I'll use an example of trying to manage assets, like information that people are deriving out of looking at books and reading annotations and old text. And so we stand up a database and we actually, give them a way to manage that. And that's, something that's not really at any other organization, maybe a handful that were part of that grant. Lots of our grant programs, then we would actually do one-off programming. But if it turned into something that was going to be used across multiple institutions, we would work to spin up a community around whatever application we're doing. I would also talk a little bit about, there's training that's provided. There's service providers out of this community. There's great communication channels. And there's just a huge value, in my opinion, of having, you're not alone. And there's benefits to your developers and your content specialists and your product owners by being in this community together and talking with people outside your institution and bringing that all back home for the benefit of your organization. So I've talked a little bit about this. Actually, I think I've talked about all of it. This is about the global presence, and this is continuing to populate. A lot of it is inside the U.S., but it is branching out, and with Ubiquity, who is, working to become one of the newest members of our community. As we have multiple service providers, we have more and more institutions starting to leverage these products, and things like Haiku that are really directed at an application being hosted for organizations that do not have developers, they do not have resources necessarily with fringe benefits and all the cost load of that, but they could pay for a hosted solution and benefit from being part of the community. We're going to see this increase. Here are all our partners to date. It's like Steve and I double-checked this, and all of this information is available on the public site as well as our wiki. This is one of the big community pictures we took. In 2010, it was 10 people. Now it's hundreds. Like Samvera Connect can run anywhere from 150 to 300. And Richard might know the numbers better than I do on that. But so Samvera Connect has had, anywhere from 150 to 300. So that proverb that we use, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I would say if you want to go fast, use Samvera, because we've actually come to the point. One of my developers, who is not always wanting to pitch in with community work, told me, all we had to do is skin this thing, plug it into our single sign-on, have our UX people change the colors, and we were ready to go. We could not have done this in 2 weeks on our own resources. And that allowed them to go do other things that they needed to focus on. So, it does take time. It does take commitment to the community. But I actually think that we can go with much more efficiency now that we have some mature products and the community built out with a lot of different specialists. So I've got the funders investment. I think the most important thing on this is we have evolved the organization and the governance models. The community and the people that come together really are the people that are making the decisions and really evolving the community. So we had a governance working group, and some of the changes that we talked about earlier and how the community is governed. It's a group out of the community that actually laid out those proposals and got alignment within the community about the kind of governance and road mapping and those kinds of things that needed to evolve in the community now that we have grown. There's also a lot of people talking about best practices and spreading that throughout our organizations, which increases solution sustainability. And you have funders who are now saying if they funded Fedora, if they funded Blacklight, if they funded Hydra, if they funded Haiku, people who propose grants that actually leverage those different solutions, that gives you a leg up in getting your grant proposal accepted, because they're looking at that they funded in the past, and they're not actually wanting people to come in and ask for money to do something boutique. Also, they're looking at the organizations that contribute back into the communities and are good players in the communities, and that also is considered a positive when they're looking at different grant proposals coming through. So that was part of the argument that I was able to make to my dean, who came in and said, I don't think we should be doing any code development. And I said, well, what about community-driven open source? And he said, well, it depends on how many people are using it. But over time, as we had these discussions, and he was out talking to funders, and he saw the kind of connections in the network and the people that were working together, he is fully behind us today in 2.5 years. Now he's asking, are we contributing back to that community? Are we contributing to Blacklight? Are we contributing to Fedora? So, and most of all, Samvera. So that's pretty much my pitch. I wanted to talk about our code, 149 million lines of code. We have 101 contributors. 19 hours since our last commit, maybe 20 at this point. Steve and I were trying to say, okay, where would we be when we're talking about this? And the activity rating over, I would say, it was this same when I looked at it in June for open repositories is very high. Excuse me?
Just in general, I've worked on other projects inside IT. Anytime that you can map the organization's mission directly to your project, it's a really good selling point.
Yes.
So if the mission is to increase the visibility of digital objects, and you can talk about that holistically with this product, then that's your best leg in.
Yes. And also, now my dean is wanting me to focus on working globally and on grant projects because he sees the value of UVA being out there, supporting this kind of effort and working with other institutions and making things viable for smaller organizations and memory institutions. So, but tying it directly to the mission as well is a really good point. So what can you do back home? Rounding out things that you've heard before. I hear people say, mention it early, mention it in the middle, and wrap it up at the end. So that's what this is. Your community resources. We have a website, wiki, GitHub. We now have annual reports, which is another good tool to use. Things look much more professional these days, and I think as we come out and prove accessibility and other things, those will only add to that. But those are tools that you can use not only to learn a lot of information, but also to work with people that you need to enroll. And try it out. You know, we've got several demo sites. And you can always put things out on the different mailing list. And it's not only what you can add or what you can learn from the community, but also what you can add. So when you ask us a question, you know, and one of our developers answers, then they feel much freer to ask you a question. So it's a very mutual commitment to what the community is all about. And I think when we're all around that shared purpose of what we're doing, protecting our digital assets, preserving them, disseminating them, and getting that knowledge out into the world. As long as we can stay around that core purpose and work together, we're going to be strong. At least that's my opinion. So any questions? Technical or otherwise? I mean, we've still got 20 minutes.
So if one was going to continue developing Samvera at your local institution, how many developers do you need? What's the...
Between 1 and like however many Stanford has. I mean, seriously, we have people doing pretty in-depth development work at small liberal arts colleges with like 1 developer, all the way through what I would consider like powerhouse institutions like Stanford and Princeton that have a zillion people. So it's sort of all over the place, and it really depends on what your needs are and what you're trying to build at your institution. And I think based on that, you can kind of scope your work with these products down to a pretty slim development team if you don't require a huge amount of customization for these things. So it's, I don't mean to be flip, but like it is really all over the board what we see people actually doing with Samvera stuff at different institutions.
I mean, we can, even prior partners that, so the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame had 1 person. That person was really active in the community and provided a lot back, built a fantastic application for them, moved on to another institution that had more developers, Penn State. But we've got several examples in the community. Even if they had a larger IT staff, they only had 1 developer that was both developing in-house, putting up the Samvera stack, but also contributing back to the community. So you could say that's even a portion of a developer.
You kind of alluded to it just a second ago, like how much of a developer or how many developers. But has there been any like actual quantitative analysis of how many resources you actually do save compared to like off-the-shelf products? Like I think that would be really helpful, like with there being some analysis, some report that administrators could, or that archivists could show to their administrators.
This is like the hardest thing in the world to do. I would rather try to launch a rocket to the moon. I mean, so like there are some people who've done some analysis like this, but it's just really challenging to figure out non-monetary, to like monetize non-monetary gains or losses, right? So even trying to estimate by participating in the community, we get this amount of money back from community-driven development is hard and maybe kind of a little bit of a smokescreen. That said, I think it would be interesting to try to do some sort of evaluation like that. We did a really like back of the envelope calculation at Oregon State over the last year. How many dollars did we spend, did we like hemorrhage out into the community by offering developer time to community development efforts, just looking at actual development efforts for new features in Hyrax versus what did we get back from other institutions contributing to feature development on Hyrax. And it was like, you know, 3 to 1 we were getting back based on this back of the envelope calculation. So
I was also going to offer that we recently did an analysis about discovery interfaces, and this wasn't necessarily about Samvera, it was about Blacklight. But by the time the stakeholders had looked at everything, our library thought that it was going to take as much development time of a different kind to make an off-the-shelf discovery interface interoperable with all of our other systems. So it was going to cost us just as much by the time you paid for the application and you paid for the talent, as it would to continue down the track and also have the added benefit of working in the community.
I was going to say that one of the things that I think about is sometimes managers get stuck on, benefits and the cost of benefits and not wanting to pay those additional charges beyond a salary, and so look to off the shelf. But then I think about our ILS, and right now, we went with a new ILS. It's hosted, and we still have 4 full-time people managing all the permissions and, helping with the configurations and when things go wrong. And that's not even the metadata people, or the circulation people, or, all the other staff that you need. And it just seems like a false argument to me, but it's really hard. It's a hard argument to overcome.
Just a follow-up that a lot of times the administrators, as you know, are thinking about the bottom line. So if this is what I would envision, like a spreadsheet template that had all of these considerations that you could plug in your answers and then calculate costs associated with them at each institution, because they're always going to be different. But that would be something really valuable to have as a resource in the community.
Yeah, I would be interested in talking more about that, but I'm having a hard time getting past all of the tangibles that need to be counted that are hard to put a dollar number on. But I understand that there's this administrative want to just compare straight numbers. But yeah, I'd be curious to talk more about that.
I would also say that I think the price of vended products and the way it's licensed can make a big difference. I mean, we were reviewing ILSs or LSPs, whichever acronym you like to use, and looking at that, gathering all the technical requirements, the user requirements, and also looking at the front end. And to switch away from what we're doing now to that would have still costed developers, but to change to the other solution rather than what we're using now, our cost would have quadrupled from what we're doing today.
Other questions or thoughts?
How we look at systems.
You can do that, but you have to say it in here.
So I could tell you how we look at systems. We just recently had this conversation. What they do, at least at the institution that I'm at, they gather all the salaries of the people that are working on Samvera. They add it up, and that's their bottom line. And so what they do with off-the-shelf products is they just look at how much is the license for that. They don't gather the salaries and the benefits for everyone participating in keeping that light switch on. And so I think if you advocate to say, well, so we're also doing now effort reporting. And so we have lots of data on saying, oh, this person worked on Voyager for 80% of their time throughout the year. You can take 80% of their salary and say, well, it's that plus Voyager.
I was trying to decide recently between having an application supported on our own infrastructure or going software as a service. And one of our sysadmins pointed out how many times people had asked them to respond in a very short time frame to changes with this application, which we would lose choice and we would lose the time. We'd have to hire professional development from the vendor because they don't allow a school to actually you know, contribute back and change the product. So, you know, that was not anything to do with Samvera, but it's along that same argument. You have to look at the total cost, not just the face value of how much it cost.
I just wanted to do a little shout out to service providers in this community as well, because I think there is now a growing middle ground where you can still do open source, but you can actually have a service provider do the kind of boring stuff for you, the hosting, the base, and then you can focus your local development effort on the kind of enhancements, the cool stuff. So I think we are starting to see more service providers in Samvera, and I think that's potentially a really healthy thing, because it also brings more users into the community who just don't have the local capacity to do the development, but can still contribute in other ways. So I think that's a valid point.
Yeah, sorry. Service providers are a whole different game than other type of vendors that are very closed off. Those are a lot like publishers trying to sell you back things.